If we look at the stories that are told of some of the women in the prophetic stories, again, this idea of women's spiritual or moral independence comes across quite clearly. So we have the story of Adam and Eve that we already talked about, where Adam and Eve, Eve is not the tempted one and the temptress, but she is equally guilty and equally repents along with Adam. The Quran also talks about the wives of Noah and the wives of Lot as being women who were married to prophets, right, some of the best people in history from the Islamic point of view, and yet betrayed them and so lost their status, not as wives, but as people who would be saved, as people who were morally validated. But on the other hand, you have the wife of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is perhaps the biggest villain in the Quran. Right? And Pharaoh is a villain not only because he oppresses the Israelites, which he does, and for which he's considered a wrongdoer in Islam, but also because he self-deifies. He considers himself a god. So he sort of is a villain on all of these different levels. And yet, the wife of Pharaoh is the one who encourages Pharaoh to bring the infant Moses that's been sent down the river into the house, takes care of Moses, raises him. And the wife of Moses, whose name is not mentioned in the Quran, but is known to Muslims as Asya, she's considered to be one of the 4 greatest women in the history of human beings, even though she's married to the biggest villain. So I think these stories make the point that it doesn't matter who you're married to. Your moral status is based only on your own deeds. And we see the story of Mary, which is the very first story I've given you there on your handout. One of the important differences about the story of Mary in the Quran is there's no Joseph, those of you who are familiar with the story. When Mary is miraculously pregnant with Jesus in the biblical story, she has Joseph to cover for her. She's already engaged to and then marries Joseph. Nobody knows that the child does not belong to Joseph. Remember that this kind of a woman getting pregnant out of wedlock could be a capital crime in the Judaism of this time. So it was a serious issue. But in the Quran, there's no Joseph. Mary has to deal with this great trial completely on her own. She has to give birth on her own. She has to bring the child to her family on her own. She has to face the accusations of sexual transgression on her own. Again, that idea of the woman as in a heroic role, right? Mary very much in a heroic role there. Okay. But when the Quran speaks, particularly when it speaks about social matters or it speaks about matters relating to marriage, it often seems to speak directly to men. So, see if I can find exactly where I wanted you to look. I can't. In any case, it's in Surah 2, and it's verse, here it is, 187. On your handout, it's section 5, point E. And it says, for example, it is lawful for you to have sexual relations with your wives on the nights during the fast. This is the fast of Ramadan, right? So previously people thought husbands and wives, first of all, can't have sexual relations while they're fasting. And so many people, it was understood that you shouldn't do this at night either. So this verse comes down clarifying you can have sexual relations with your wife at night. But note that it doesn't say husbands and wives can have sexual relations with each other and put it in that kind of neutral term. Right? It's addressed to men. So it is lawful for you to have sexual relations with your wives. And this is the case in many, as I said, verses that deal with marital relations. And this bothered some people, most notably Salama, who I mentioned before, the wife of the Prophet, Salama. And so she asked the Prophet about this, and she said, why is it that the Quran in many places seems to speak to men and not to women? And the Prophet doesn't know the answer to that question, and so he doesn't say anything. He doesn't say, how dare you question the word of God? How dare you question the way God speaks to me? How dare you bring up this issue? He doesn't even say to her, don't worry, when it says, Muslims, Muslimun or believers, mu'minun, grammatically it includes women or something like that. All of those things that he might have said. But he doesn't. He doesn't say anything because he doesn't know what the answer is. And then it said that later that day when Muhammad prayed, he received a new revelation. And that revelation very much seems to be a response to Salama's question. And that is right on your very first page in section 1, number C. C is not a number, right? Letter C. Verily the Muslims, men and women, the believing men and women, the obedient men and women, the truthful men and women, the patient men and women, the humble men and women, the men and women who give charity, the men and women who fast, the men and women who guard their chastity, the men and women who remember God often in the hearts and with their tongues, God has prepared for them forgiveness and a great reward. Right? If one did not know the context of this, it almost seems like we get it already, men and women, right? But it goes on and on. Men who do this and women who do this, and men who are like this and women who are like this. Right? Going through a series of virtues, of virtuous attitudes, of moral attitudes, as well as religious duties. Right? Like giving charity, for example. Right? This is a very strong statement saying that the moral duties, and therefore also the moral capacity of men and women, is equal. There are other verses, some that you have here on the very next page, section 1, letter E, talking about the believing men and women, again, meaning the men and women of the Muslim community. But the believing men and believing women are protectors of one another, enjoining right and forbidding wrong, performing the prayer, giving alms, obeying God and his messenger. They are those to whom God will, on whom God will have mercy. Right? Truly God is mighty and wise. And you can read this to mean that men and women are equally responsible for morally advising one another. Right? The men and the women, they are protectors of one another, enjoining right and forbidding wrong. Okay? We have other cases where the Quran directly responds to a situation of injustice toward women. In Arabia, pre-Islamic Arabia, there was, as strange as it may sound, a custom where when you wanted to get rid of your wife, you didn't want her around anymore. You wanted to sort of make it a situation where you didn't divorce her, so she couldn't really get married again, but you kind of ended all real marital relations with her. You would say to her, "You are to me like the back of my mother." And it was this particular form of really sort of spitefully putting your wife in this bad situation was called Zihaar, which means back, as in the back of my mother. So anyway, there was a situation where a couple had been married for a long time. They were an older couple, and they got into an argument of some kind. And in a moment of anger, the husband made this pronouncement. And then afterward, they both regretted it. They'd been married a long time. They didn't want this to happen. And so the wife said to her husband, look, they were both Muslim. Right? Why don't you go to the Prophet and see what he has to say about this? Maybe he'll just say, it doesn't matter. And the man said, oh, no, I'm embarrassed to go. And she says, all right, fine, I'll go. So she goes and she tells the Prophet the story. And the Prophet says, oh, that's terrible, but I don't have any revelation from God telling me that the Zihaar is not still legitimate, right? I can't just pronounce that everything's normal between you, the two of you. And the woman continued on. She continued to complain. She said, look, he's old and he needs me. And I don't know what he's going to do without me. And we've been married a long time and none of this should have happened. It was just a moment of anger. Please, can't you do something about it? And she went on so much as the Prophet even started to cry. He was so sad about this. But he said, I can't do anything about this. Right? And then a verse comes down saying, we have heard the woman who disputes with you. You, Muhammad. We've heard the woman disputing with you. And the revelation goes on to say that this is meaningless. Right? And that a man should not do this. If he does, there's a certain degree of expiation that he has to do. He has to do something to atone for this act. And the name of the surah where that comes down is Al-Mujadila, which means the female disputant, the female who argues, right, about this. And again, so these things I think are important. Okay. But at the same time, right, while men and women are pretty clearly spiritual and moral equals in the Quran, there is also a very clear social differentiation. Right? Islam doesn't invent patriarchy. It emerges in a context of patriarchy. And it does not overturn that patriarchy.